River Basin. So we host these webinars with the Ag Water Network to help keep producers and others informed about water-related topics that affect agriculture, including plans, programs, funding, and potential curtailments. So we're going to talk about all those things today. Our presenters are Nora Flynn and Amy Ostdiek, who are both with the Colorado Water Conservation Board. And Nora is the Senior Ag Water Specialist, and she's going to be sharing with us what our new state water plan update says about ag, including needs and goals. And then Amy, who's the section chief of the Interstate, Federal, and Water Information section, will be speaking about the Colorado River Basin dilemma and how it can potentially influence all of our basins in the state. Before we get rolling, if you have any technical questions, you can email those to Aaron@coloradocattle.org, or you can just call the CCA office at 303-431-6422. That's 303-431-6422. And then if you have questions for our speakers, we can go ahead and include those in the chat box. We'll come back to questions at the end. So we're not going to take them in between our two speakers, but we'll try to get it to as many as we can at the end. So our first speaker is Amy. Amy Ostdiek is the section chief of the Interstate, Federal, and Water Information section at CWCB. Much of her work has focused on Colorado River matters, including supporting Commissioner Becky Mitchell in her role as Colorado's principal negotiator on interstate Colorado River matters. And prior to joining CWCB, Amy was an assistant attorney general with the Colorado River subunit at the Colorado Attorney General's office. Amy is originally from Western Nebraska, so she attended the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and then the University of Colorado Law School. So Amy has a really strong background and understanding of the intricacies of our interstate compact and the agreements that we have between the Upper Basin states and the Lower Basin states, as well as the legal settlements that go along with those and the operating guidelines. All of those together make up the law of the river. And so Amy is going to walk us through where we're at right now in terms of the Colorado River Basin, and just kind of broad brush things that are really good to know about that, and then kind of bring that down a little bit closer to statewide and what potential impact that could have on our different basins in the state. So if you're ready, Amy, we'll go ahead and get rolling.
Sure. Thank you so much, Phil. First, I just want to make sure that you can see my screen. It's always a struggle to make sure that's working. Okay, good. Thank you, Tina. And good to see you. So as Phil said, my name is Amy Ostdiek. I'm the section chief of the Interstate, Federal, and Water Information section at CWCB. And a lot of my work is focused on supporting Becky Mitchell as the chief negotiator on behalf of the state on Colorado River matters. So as you can imagine, it's been a long, I'd like to say year, but it's been a long few years. There's a lot going on right now, and I'm happy to be here today to provide you with an update. So it is a little bit kind of, I guess, awkward to start a presentation on current issues on the Colorado River with a 100-year-old compact, but I think it's really, really important that we do start there for a few reasons that I'll go over. So the basin states developed this compact 101 years ago now, back in 1922. And the thing I really want to emphasize first and foremost is that it remains in place today. You hear a lot in the news about, are we renegotiating the compact? What's going on there? And the short answer is we're not. And none of the basin states believe that that's the best approach right now. And I want to tell you why it's specifically really important to the upper division states that we not renegotiate the compact. And I'm going to show you a map of the basin in a second, but the upper division states include Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. So just a little brief kind of history here. At the time that the compact was being under consideration, or before the compact was developed, Delph Carpenter in Colorado was looking downstream at California and seeing a lot of development there. They were developing what would be very senior water rights. He became concerned about what does that mean for Colorado, for our rights on the Colorado River. Meanwhile, there was a Supreme Court decree that came down around that time, essentially saying that if you have two states, neighboring states, River Basin, I'm hearing, oh, there we go. If you have two neighboring states in a river basin, and they both recognize the prior appropriation doctrine, that's going to apply across state lines. So what that meant is that if California was developing these senior water rights, if the Supreme Court was saying those senior water rights would apply across state lines, that's a problem for Colorado. Delph-Carpenter wanted to preserve our ability and our right to grow into the future in perpetuity, notwithstanding what was happening in California at the time. So another thing you hear in the news a lot, or you hear people saying a lot, is California has senior rights on the river. That's not true. They might with respect to the lower basin states, but they don't with respect to Colorado or any of the other upper division states. And the reason for that is the compact. So what Article 3A of the compact does is it apportions equal shares of the river to the upper basin and lower basin. So when you have a compact in place, that overrides any other Supreme Court precedent that you might have or any other rules. It's saying, you know, the states are making their own rules here. We're making our own decision about how this is going to work for us. That's exactly what happened with the compact. So equal shares of the river were apportioned to the upper and lower basins. That's 7.5 million acre feet in perpetuity. There was an additional 1 million acre feet apportioned to the lower basin states, and that was meant to deal with the tributary issue down there. So that's a huge, I think, critically important reason that the compact remains important to us today, because it preserves our equal share of the river to the lower division states without priority. Another point I want to make here, I'm not going to go over all the provisions, but another one is Article 3D. And I guess I could just call this the fake news presentation, because you hear so much about the Colorado River Compact in the news, and I just want to kind of dispel some of those myths and rumors. And this is another one of those. You frequently hear that the upper division states owe a delivery obligation to the lower division states, and that's really not exactly true. It's actually a non-depletion obligation. And again, something that Delph-Carpenter was really thinking about at this time, and all of the drafters of the compact, was that we have really variable hydrology in the upper basin. Our snowpack really changes year to year. So we should not be on the hook for finding any amount of water and putting it in the river when the river simply isn't providing in that year. So instead of a delivery obligation, we have a non-depletion aggregation or obligation, sorry. So we are not to cause the flow of the river to be depleted below an aggregate of 75 million acre feet over a 10-year period. That 10-year period is another thing I want to point out, because you frequently hear it's an annual obligation. But again, recognizing the variable hydrology, it's actually a 10-year obligation, because we might have really dry years and then really wet years. And this gives us the ability to look at that in a 10-year chunk. So those are a few important points that I wanted to raise. There's a lot more there, jam-packed into 4 pages of text. So go read it. It's interesting and also very surprisingly brief. So, the next kind of thing I want to point out is, so you have 16 million acre feet of water apportioned in the compact. We all know today the river simply doesn't provide that much. I'm going to get in a little bit to some of the agreements that we have in place that are all subject to the compacts to deal with those shortages. But first, I want to just point out some realities of the basin. So this is the map I promised you, the upper basin and the lower basin. And you see these 2 highlighted boxes. Those are the major reservoirs on the system. So the one a little bit higher up is Glen Canyon Dam, Lake Powell. The one below it is Lake Mead. And the very critically important point here is that, as we know, those major reservoirs are below our uses in the upper basin. Once water is in Lake Powell, we can't pull it back up to Colorado, right? So what that means is that we in the upper basin are fully dependent on snowpack for our water supply. In the lower basin states, with those major reservoirs above them, they have been able to, year after year, draw down those reservoirs, continue using water from storage, even though we've seen record low inflows into the reservoirs in those years. So it's given them a degree of certainty and security and allowed them to put in full water orders and get all that water, even when we have record low inflow into the reservoirs. We haven't had the ability to do that in the upper basin because, again, we rely entirely on snowpack. So our uses go down when snowpack goes down. And we think, not only is that the way that we're forced to do it, but that's a good way to do it because it gives us the ability to live within the means of what the river provides on an annual basis. And that's exactly what we've been doing forever. So just wanted to kind of point that out. So you see the 7.5 equal apportionments. Well, we in the Upper Basin are not always able to take our full apportionment of the river. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't share the shortages equally across the basin. That doesn't mean that we still shouldn't honor that equity that is in place in the compact. So I just want to highlight kind of what that has meant in terms of water use. You know, the fact that the lower basin states have these major reservoirs above them. And what you're seeing here, the orange bar on the left is lower basin state use. What you see on the right is upper basin states use. And you see that dotted line of the 7.5 million acre foot apportionment. This is just the last few years. And what you see is that the lower basin states, because they've been able to rely on that storage, have used just south of 10 million acre feet every year. 2021 was a super, super dry year. We had record low inflows into the reservoirs. And nonetheless, the lower basin states used nearly 10 million acre feet because they could, because they took water out of Lake Mead, which then took water out of Lake Powell. In the upper basin, we cut our uses by 25% in 2021 from 2020. It's 1 million acre foot reduction because the water wasn't there, wasn't legally or physically available. And because of the way our prior appropriation doctrine works in some cases, just wasn't legally available within the state. So as you can see, the upper basin has been regularly well below our compact apportionment. The lower basin, suffice it to say, has not. They've been well above their compact apportionment. So this is why, you know, you hear a lot in the news about the reservoirs, like Powell and Lake Mead tanking, and you hear a lot about the prolonged drought and climate change. And what I want to say is that, yes, we have been in a record drought. We all know that in the Colorado River Basin. Climate change is definitely impacting the flows. That's only part of the story. As you've had record low inflows into Lake Powell, you've also had large releases out of Lake Mead. And I think 2021 is a good example of that. And what this is showing here, in blue, you see the inflow into Lake Powell in a given year. In red, you see what was released from Lake Powell in that same year. You have some variability there, right? In 2019, we had decent inflow. In 2021, on the other hand, we had 3.5 million acre feet of water flow into Lake Powell. 8.23 flowed out of Lake Powell. So I'm not an engineer, I am not good at math, but that is a very simple way to understand why the reservoirs have gotten to critically low levels. When you take more out, especially that much more than is going in, they will continue to go down. And that's why we are where we are today. Part of it too is because of the operation of the current rules in place. And what I will say is that all of these are subject to the compact. That's really important to understand. The compact, again, remains in place. The equity that is committed under the compact remains in place. But we have some interim agreements that were designed to protect the system in light of the really challenging hydrology. First, the 07 guidelines, and kind of at a high level, what those aim for is coordinated operations of Lake Powell and Lake Mead. So you have a table in the record of decision that essentially says when Lake Powell is here and when Lake Mead is here, this is how much water gets released from Lake Powell. So as you can imagine, when Lake Mead is lower and Lake Powell is higher, more water is going to be released from Lake Powell. There's a lot of other stuff in the 07 guidelines, including shortage sharing guidelines for the lower basin states. But ultimately what occurred is that there was a recognition that the 07 guidelines simply wouldn't be enough to protect the system through 2025 when they expire. That's why the 2019 drought contingency plans came into place. These were designed to provide an additional layer of security, additional tools that we might employ to protect critical elevations at Lake Powell and Lake Mead. All of those agreements expire at the end of 2025. And it happened again. There was recognition that even these two agreements together would not be sufficient to protect the system. And so as you've probably heard a lot recently in the news, the Bureau of Reclamation has recently called for additional conservation measures needed, 2 to 4 million acre feet to be exact. And also they're looking at additional flexibilities that they might be able to use to protect the system. So that's kind of the brings us up to the current state of play where we are right now. So I want to highlight some of the things that the upper division states have done to respond to that call. I want to first say that we recognize this is not a crisis that we created. You can, I think, see clearly from the graph that I provided earlier that the upper division states regularly use significantly less than our compact apportionment. So in water short years, our water users are already very, very cut back because of how the prior appropriation doctrine works. A lot of times you have pre-compact rights that are being curtailed simply because of intra-state water rights administration. So I just want to preface all this by saying our options are limited. We're already using only what we need from the river in a given year. On top of that, we're dealing with depleted storage. So recognizing the limitations on what we can do, we still wanted to be part of the solution. So a few things here that we have done to date. Upper Basin reservoirs have provided 661,000 acre-feet of water to protect Lake Powell. Now that's through the Drought Response Operations Agreement, which is part of that 2019 DCP package, which calls for essentially the Upper Basin states to work together to look at flexibilities and operations at the initial units, Flaming Gorge, Navajo, Blue Mesa reservoirs, to send additional water to Powell when it's needed to protect elevations there. So we've sent 661,000 acre-feet, which is a lot of water. A lot of that came from Flaming Gorge. Some of that came from Blue Mesa Reservoir in Colorado and had some real impacts on the local economy there. So we are continuing to have those discussions, but also being very, very mindful of the impacts that additional releases could have on the security of the whole system and also on the local economies that really depend on those reservoirs for revenue and a lot of other things. So another thing that I already emphasized this is reducing our uses when there's not enough water. And this is, I think, the point that I want to drive home more than anything today, is that from our perspective, from Colorado's perspective, the most impactful thing that can be done to save the Colorado River system is live within the means of what the river provides every year. And the prior appropriation doctrine in Colorado gives us a good mechanism to do that. That doesn't mean it's not painful to our water users. It just means it provides some level of certainty in how that will be carried out. If everyone had been living within the means of what the river provides every year, we wouldn't be in the situation we are now. And finally, I just wanted to highlight some of the actions we're taking through the 5-point plan that the upper division states put out in response to the call for additional conservation measures. 2 of these are similar in nature. That's System Conservation Pilot Program and Demand Management Feasibility Investigation. They're both large-scale, temporary, voluntary, compensated conservation programs that would take place across the Upper Basin. The System Conservation Pilot Program has actually been reauthorized, so that is something that is going forward. There's more information available at the UCRC's website, the Upper Colorado River Commission's website, which is at this link. Applications are currently due on February 1st. So if you want more information, definitely go check out the website. Demand management, we are still in the feasibility investigation stage for that. It's like a System Conservation Pilot Program, but would require more stringent monitoring efforts and shepherding of that water to Lake Powell. And the purpose of it would be to ensure ongoing compliance with the Colorado River Compact rather than mitigating the impacts of drought in the Upper Basin as SCPP is for. So similar but different. The Drought Response Operations Plan, I've already told you about that, the fact that we've released 661,000 acre-feet of water already. We're considering potential additional releases subject to a number of conditions. So that's something that we've committed to considering. We're looking at putting bipartisan infrastructure funding, and already have actually, to use to enhance measurement, monitoring, reporting of water use. I think it's critical to understand how water is moving if you want to make any of these tools effective. And finally, I'll just say it again, strict water rights administration, living within the means of what the river provides every year. We're going to continue doing that because we continue to believe that is the most impactful thing that can be done to protect the system. So this is my last slide, and I know it's kind of an odd slide to end on, but I kind of just want to bring it back home and emphasize a few things. One is, first, the Colorado River is critically important to the state of Colorado. I think it's something like 35% of our water comes from the Colorado River system, and a lot of that comes across the divide through transbasin diversions. So, what happens on the Colorado impacts everyone in the state. And what we have seen, again, and this is a graph showing unregulated inflow into Lake Powell. So it's kind of a good measure of year to year, how much snowpack are we getting and how much of that is getting into Lake Powell. If you look at the last 22, 23 years, it's highly, highly variable, but we just haven't had a lot of water to put it, just as straightforward as I can. We are seeing unprecedented dry conditions in the Colorado River Basin. And what that means for trans-basin diverters is that they don't have as reliable of a supply from the Colorado Basin as they once did. So, I guess I also want to emphasize, we get a lot of questions about the compact. Are we in compact administration? The answer is no. We have always been in compliance with the compact. We don't foresee someone coming in and telling us you must stop using water because you're in violation. That doesn't mean that we don't have to deal with the realities of hydrology. That doesn't mean that we're not dealing with just a drier basin and needing to adjust accordingly and adapt accordingly. And I think that the state of Colorado as a whole has done a great job of figuring that out over the last 22 years, albeit painfully. We're going to have to continue figuring out how to do more with less as we continue to likely look at a very dry but highly variable future. So I think I'll leave it there for now and turn it over to Nora.
All right, great. Thanks, Amy. So Nora, we're going to switch gears here and kind of bring it a little closer to Colorado. And Nora is the Senior Ag Water Specialist for the Water Supply Planning section of CWCB. And she works on a variety of projects and strategies at CWCB for increasing drought resilience of ag in Colorado. She has a PhD in soil and crop science from CSU, and she has a specialization in deficit irrigation of row crops and soil health. So Nora has a deep understanding of what happens to crops and forage when there's not enough water to irrigate them. So she's going to be talking to us about approaches and funding for helping to try to maintain what's in the water plan. The goal for ag is to maintain robust agriculture, I believe. And so that's what we're trying to achieve here with less water. So Nora, if you're ready to go, please proceed.
Thanks, Phil. My slides look okay? Great, thanks. So talk to you guys about the Colorado Water Plan. The Colorado Water Plan, if you haven't heard, we're just finishing the 2023 update. We are hosting a big party in Denver on Tuesday in the Rhino area. And so if you're around, we'd love to invite you to come to that party. It's open to anyone in the public. And there's going to be a panel discussion and live band and drinks and food trucks and all that type of thing. So we're getting to the end of this 2023 water plan update. This is the first update to the water plan, which was originally released in 2015. And since then, we've had years of stakeholder outreach, gathering feedback and input, drafts, public comments, to get to the point that we are now. So lots of people involved over many years in creating the Colorado Water Plan of 2023. So just in case you didn't hear a lot from us over the past couple of years about this, what is the water plan? So the water plan in 2023 is about a 200-page document, and what you can find inside is descriptions of historical water uses in Colorado, how were the compacts come about, what are different water uses, what are different challenges we have and that face our water supply, like climate change and population growth. And we have all of that information kind of focused on two goals, which are, it's an opportunity to partner with the CWCB and other state agencies. So setting the stage for collaboration. And we feel really ready to do that since the writing of the Colorado Plan was such a collaborative process. And it's also a strategy document for CWCB staff. So I'm the agriculture specialist, so I will be really digging into tackling the goals we have for the agriculture section. And we also have, staff who are experts in non-consumptive uses like in-stream flow for endangered fish and things like that. So rest assured, although the topics in the water plan are extremely diverse, we have staff at CWCB working very hard on it. So the 2023 update is organized, at least in the action areas, into these 4 areas: vibrant communities, thriving watersheds, resilient planning, and robust agriculture. These 4 areas really help us focus our attention, but we recognize throughout the plan that all of these areas are, of course, super interconnected. And for example, there's quite a bit of discussion about how healthy forests, the thriving watersheds section is so important for, harboring our snowpack and delivering clean water for agriculture and municipal use downstream. So lots of connections. And so these 4 quadrants aren't at all meant to separate water users in their thinking about solving these big problems. So I'll tell you a little bit, give you a flavor for what kind of stuff we have going on in the robust agriculture section. So in the robust agriculture section, one of the things we heard a lot during scoping was about studying the impacts of soil management, or you may have heard, terms like soil health or regenerative agriculture. What are the impacts of that type of practice on water conservation? Something I sometimes hear on the field is, well, I really want to improve my soil health so that I don't have to use as much water. Well, we want to do research on that. We want to support exploration into ideas like that to make sure that we're really supporting, staying in line with previous historical uses of water, but also, what can we do that's really creative and innovative to help agricultural producers thrive and persist in really arid conditions. Something else we have in there is about encouraging collaborative water sharing agreements. These have also been called alternative transfer methods. And the emphasis here with collaborative water sharing agreements are creating opportunities for agricultural water producers, agricultural producers with water rights to utilize those water rights in a way that can generate additional income stream to their operation so that they can sustain their agricultural operation. So for example, an agricultural producer with water rights might enter, a voluntary, temporary, compensated arrangement with a municipality nearby where 3 out of 10 years they have the option of leasing water to that municipality for an agreed upon price. And in that year, the agricultural producer would, irrigate less or fallow a field. And we realize that this practice is really not for everyone, but there have been many calls for creating more flexibility, being able to use water creatively to, sustain agricultural production and create that additional revenue stream for farms and reduce the pressure of buy and dry on it. Another example of something we have in the action section is supporting peer-to-peer learning between ag producers. So an example of this would be something like our Colorado Master Irrigator program, which has been really successful in the Republican River Basin and then in the Rio Grande Basin as well. And that's a setting where CWCB provides grant money to bring together and compensate the time of farmers to get together and talk about, what are they doing that is helping them be more profitable? And in those specific regions, what are they doing that, is making their operation sustainable into the future and helping to protect groundwater levels that they're so dependent on in those areas. Another area, another example of that peer-to-peer learning that I just want to point out to this group is that this is another one of our grantees called Drought Advisors. And this is a collaboration between CSU Extension and Rocky Mountain Farmers Union. You might recognize this gentleman in this video is Harrison Top. He grows fruit on the western slope in the Hotchkiss area. And Drought Advisors is, like I said, a grantee of ours. And through January 23rd, so just a few more days, agricultural producers can put their name in to be a part of a drought planning process. And in that process, you get access to, folks at CSU Extension and other, experts in sort of drought planning. This could be, sort of veteran drought planners in your agricultural community. And so, and the program is offering incentives, up to $1,500 for participating in that, or creating a drought plan, and acting on that plan. So just wanted to highlight that as a really cool opportunity. And the website for Drought Advisors is really well done, and they have a lot of really great information on there. So worth a visit for sure. So next, I told Phil I would tell you about funding opportunities, because at CWCB, I don't know exactly how many staff we have now. I used to say around 50. I think we're growing maybe towards 60, 65 now, but it's still relatively small group of people considering all the stuff we want to get done. So funding projects is a major way we actually get the objectives and goals in the water plan. So I want to highlight some of those for you. And the next couple slides might be a bit wordy, but my goal is that if you're really keen to apply for funding, you can just take a screenshot of these slides and take your next steps from there. So I'm going to talk about 4 different funding opportunities that might be a good fit for you. So first, water plan grants. The purpose is in the title, to support the water plan. We have 2 deadlines for this every year. The amount of funding available is variable, but this past year, there was about $1.5 million available for agriculture. We have a lot of reason to expect that to be higher in 2023. And the overall water plan bucket is, I think that this past year was around 15 million. So what types of projects? I'm going to jump down and talk about examples, because you might be wondering, oh, I have something I'm interested in doing, but which program is it a good fit for? So with water plan grants, we're really looking for stuff that is in line with what we have written in the water plan, but that itself can be very broad. So for example, we fund research, measuring conserved consumptive use on high elevation hay meadows, for example, is a project we have funded. We fund educational projects. So like that Colorado Master Irrigator program that I mentioned, where it's a space for people to learn and share ideas. We also fund infrastructure type of projects with the agricultural category of water plan grants. And so last year we funded a diversion improvement structure that had co-benefits for fish passage and recreational safety on the river. So with water plan grants, we're really looking for projects that are wide-reaching, have, scalable impact, can create a lot of learning to benefit water users across the state. So, and these projects, in my time at CWCB, the smallest one we funded for the agriculture category was $20,000, and the largest was $600,000. So a pretty wide range there in what you can apply for. Water Supply Reserve Fund grants. This one's a little bit trickier. The meaning is not necessarily in the title. These have more frequent deadlines, and the focus is right now on drought resilience and aging infrastructure. So the funding for this category of grants is also variable, But recently, each Basin Roundtable, was brought up to $1 million that they have to support projects. And then there's another 11 million in a statewide account. So if you're not already involved in your Basin Roundtable, I highly encourage you to start there, because all projects for WSRF need to be vetted and supported by Basin Roundtables before they can come to the main CWCB office. Another awesome one with a lot of money right now is the Federal Technical Assistance Grants. This is ARPA funding that CWCB is managing. The deadline is rolling. We have $5 million available for this. And once it runs out, it runs out. This one will not be refreshed. And we have, I think, until the end of 2024 to get most of this money contracted. So this is one that we will be pushing a lot, trying to get people to apply to. The emphasis here is bringing federal dollars back to Colorado. So the types of projects, is project development, capacity building, all the things we hear so much from stakeholders about not having enough time and resources to put together those really complicated federal grant applications. This is meant to help fill that gap. So it can help with site assessments, information collection, coordinating with stakeholders, just having meetings to get everyone to the table to make these projects come to fruition. And also can support hiring a grant writer. So highly encourage you to check that out on our website. This is meant to be, approachable for folks of all different levels of experience of applying for projects. So if you have been if this is not your first rodeo, you've applied for federal money in the past, there's money available for, a grantee to just hire the contractor that they are familiar with, that they have been working with. But also if you are, maybe don't even know where to start in terms of hiring a contractor, the CWCB has selected a few folks that we know will do a great job in assisting you, sifting through those different opportunities and help you get to turning in a federal grant application. So. And then this last one I want to mention is the Water Project Loan Program. This is far from new. The Water Project Loan Program, has been around for over 50 years. And, the deadline kind of depends on the size of the loan. The types of projects that are better fit for this program are the really big dollar ones. We have a minimum loan amount of $100,000 to participate in the loan program. And of course, we have projects in the tens of millions of dollars participating in this. And so kind of depends how big the loan is, would depend when your application deadline would be. And the rate currently available that we have published on our website, at least, is 1.8%, and that does change, so it's worth checking back. Types of projects, this is where you can go for really big infrastructure, like reservoir rehabilitation type of work, ditches, canals, pipelines, diversion structures. We sometimes, when we get really large asks for grants, we will suggest pairing it with a loan. And that's something we really like to be able to offer, at CWCB, is helping with some grant money, but also realizing that some projects are really large and expensive. And so this loan program is a really excellent complement to get things done. And I am far from the finance expert. And so I just wanted to put Matt Stern's email there because he's our lead on that. So. And that is the end of that. So thanks for your attention. And I think Amy and I are both willing to take questions at this point.
Thanks, Nora. So yeah, that's a great, just kind of a start, really. I feel like we just scratched the surface with both what Amy has said and what you have said in terms of, all the things related to the funding that's available and drought resilience, and how we're working as a state on lots of different projects to try to figure out how we can do as much or even more with less water, and the soil health aspect of that. And then just figuring out maybe different types of forages that might work better when we've got kind of changing conditions, both in temperature as well as our water supply. But so I thought maybe we'd start on our questions with you, Nora, and then we'll loop back to Amy, just kind of reverse the order of your speaking. And this is also a really good time if anybody's got questions. If you want to put those in the chat, that's fine. You can do that and we'll just go through them from there. Or if you want to unmute and you want to just ask your question, we've got a pretty small group here. So just go ahead and do that. And we'll just, we'll roll through here with whatever questions we get. So don't be shy. Nora, so one question I wanted to ask is if you could just kind of walk us through how some of these grants can be put together. You talked about a few. I know there's a lot more that you guys manage. And for example, taking that Water Supply Reserve Fund grant, you can get both your Basin Roundtable WSRF grant as well as the state grant. How can those two be put together along with, of course, the applicant money that they bring to bear, or the match?
That's a great question, Phil. We have been wrestling with our communication strategy on the match requirement for WSRF. So I'll do my best. So overall, big picture, applicants need to come with a 25% match for their overall project cost. But as a part of that, the Basin Roundtable also needs to chip in to projects. And so that's 10% of an overall project cost. And so the first step would be to put together your entire budget and then go to your Basin Roundtable, ask for their support. And if they do support your project, they, out of their Basin Roundtable account, would contribute 10%. And part of the reason we do that is because it's an example of local control over water project implementation and that local vetting process. And so that's kind of why we have that additional step. And then project proponents can then access statewide grant funding as well. So I'm maybe not explaining that the best, but I'll drop a link in the chat to our WSRF guidelines. But that's roughly how it works, is your Basin Roundtable contributes a chunk, and then you can come to the statewide bucket for a much larger chunk of your project cost.
Okay. And that match, I think up to half of that match can be in kind, right, from the applicant?
That's a really good point, Phil. Yeah, half of it can be in kind. And that is true for water plan grants as well, can be in kind. The matching requirement for water plan grants is also 25% for projects that are in the vein of a study. For projects that are more construction oriented, it's a 50% match. And in both cases, half of that match can be in kind.
Okay, so when you combine the Basin Fund, which is a minimum 10%, but I suppose it could be higher than that. Is that right? In some instances, it could be more than 10% of the project cost. And then you get the statewide fund. It could wind up that the applicant, when you figure in the half that can from them that can come from in-kind services, could really be a pretty small cash match.
Yep. Yeah, and Phil is a veteran applicant to all of these sources of funding. So he's a great person to ask questions to as well.
And I would say you guys do with no more than 50 or 60 staff, you do a fantastic job of kind of riding her on all of the grants that you have, because you have a lot of them and they often change. One thing I don't want to put you on the spot here. This may be a tough question, but you mentioned the federal technical assistance grant. And one question I had, that is really a grant that's to be used for pre-development work. So trying to bring in those federal dollars, as you mentioned, but there's oftentimes a lot of work. There's meetings and grant writing, as you mentioned. There's also sometimes surveying, and there's engineering, and there's lots of different studies sometimes can go into just getting prepared to apply for a large federal grant, like through Bureau of Reclamation, et cetera. What I wondered is, you mentioned the System Conservation Pilot Program, which is kind of a different animal, right? Could the Federal Technical Assistance Grant be used to do that pre-development or preparatory work for applying for system conservation?
I think so, but I believe Amy said this SDPP is coming up on a deadline pretty soon. So I don't know, in theory, yes, but in reality, maybe not, given how short the turnaround is for SDPP at this point.
That's exactly what I was going to say, Nora, is I think that is the type of opportunity that would work for that, I think. But given the tight turnaround and the fact that applications are due on February 1st, it might not work this time around. But other types of, conservation programs that might be in place in the future that would allow that timing to work, I think it certainly could be appropriate.
Yeah, Amy, do you know if there will be another round for SDPP, in the next couple of years, or is it just kind of this one deadline for now?
For now, it's the one deadline. I think it is possible it could be extended into the future, but for now, the federal authorization only extends through, I want to say, September of 2024. So we would need to seek additional authorization for it. So right now, we're really just looking at a one-year program that could be extended.
Yeah. Sounds good. I'm going to also put, if you just want to peruse, what could you use this opportunity for? We have worked on something called the Water Opportunity Navigator, which I think is kept edited and kept live, fresh. And so that would be another great place to look if you just wanted to do some preliminary perusing of what you could use it for.
So that's a nice, we may get more questions, I don't know, but that's a great segue for another question that I had on the System Conservation Pilot Program and the demand management side of things. And just, you had just touched on those, Amy, and I wondered if you could kind of break that down a little more for us and just explain it, because I think you said demand management is going to require a little more scrutiny. It's going to have some more analysis. So could you just kind of explain those a little, just a little more?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you asked that, because I feel like I just kind of glossed over a lot of complicated information, including, the distinctions between SCPP and demand management. So I'll start with demand management. The Demand Management Storage Agreement was part of the 2019 Drought Contingency Plan Agreement. And as I said, that whole suite of agreements was meant to provide additional potential tools to protect critical elevations of the reservoir. So put more water in Lake Powell and Lake Mead, essentially. The Demand Management Storage Agreement, what it does is it provides for up to 500,000 acre feet of storage in Lake Powell, free storage that the upper division states of Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming could use. And how we would fill that is creating a large scale conservation program, temporary, voluntary, compensated, so people can choose to participate or not and get paid for doing so. That pool of water, one point to make is it's invisible to the 07 guidelines. And what that means is, I kind of explained very high level of the 07 guidelines. The goal is to kind of balance the reservoirs. So again, if Lake Mead is low and Lake Powell is higher, more water is going to be released from Powell. What this would do is give us the ability to have that water be invisible to that, if that makes sense. So it would stay in Lake Powell, not be released to the lower basin, unless and until the Upper Colorado River Commission, which is made up of 4 upper division states, determine it should be released. And it could only be released for purposes of compact compliance, ongoing compliance with the 1922 compact, which I'll say again, we're very much in compliance with and never have been out of compliance. So that's a limited tool for a limited purpose. And because we have to track that water into Lake Powell and we have to know how much is there, there are some pretty stringent requirements in terms of shepherding the water, monitoring, verifying, all of that. We don't know what those requirements would be because we haven't even reached agreement on them among the upper division states. We're still in the feasibility investigation, just looking at how that might work. And then we would actually have to agree on how it would work. One thing I want to highlight there is the UCRC recently completed a lot of work on the interstate investigation, the interstate components of that, recognizing there are some issues that are very interstate focused and some that are very Colorado specific that we need to figure out within our own states, same for all the other upper division states. So the UCRC has completed a couple of reports that are available on their website about the interstate investigation, but we're now each going back to our own states and thinking about what the open questions are that we have there. So there's no demand management program now, and like you said, and like I kind of explained, the requirements, would be more stringent. System conservation pilot program, the similarities are that it is, again, temporary, voluntary, compensated reductions in consumptive use. So water users voluntarily agreeing to not use their water for a year and get paid for doing so. The difference is that is system water. So we are not shepherding that water. We are not tracking that water. We're not ensuring that it gets anywhere, including to Lake Powell. It just goes back into the river. There are still some, monitoring verification requirements, like just going out and making sure that that field is fallowed, for example. That's the type of verification that occurs with SCPP. The other thing or point I'll make about SCPP, System Conservation Pilot Program, is that it was previously operational from I think I said in my slide 2014 to 2018. I think it's actually 2015 to 2018. So we've done this before. We know kind of how it goes. It conserved about 40,000 acre feet over 4 years in all 4 upper division states, is the estimate. And there are reports about that as well at the UCRC website. So I'm happy to drop links to both the demand management investigation information and also the SCPP information. I just feel like I said a lot, so sorry.
Yeah, you did. But that's good. So, and then just to be clear on the demand management side, you had mentioned earlier that the upper basin has already provided 661,000 acre feet into Lake Powell, but that was not counted to our credit. Is that right?
That is a great question. And one thing I just want to clarify here is that 661,000 acre feet was not through demand management. That was actually from reservoir releases through the Drought Response Operations Agreement. So that's water that was just released from 500,000 acre feet from Flaming Gorge, actually more than that from Flaming Gorge, 600,000, I can't remember the exact numbers, and some from Blue Mesa Reservoir. So that's different than demand management. That water, the purpose of the Drought Response Operations Agreement is for that water to protect critical elevations at Lake Powell. And we are still in discussions about how that water is being modeled and accounted for in Lake Powell.
So speaking of Lake Powell and Lake Mead, they've been continuing to go down. We've been doing our part, as you showed on those 2 pretty amazing slides. The lower basin has been actually using more in the face of drier conditions and lower inflows. So it's kind of an amazingly stark contrast when you look at those 2 sets of slides that you showed. One thing that you pointed out was that there is in the language in the compact says the upper basin shall not deplete more than 75 million or 7.5 on an average year. But the lower basin seems to have a different opinion of that. And so we hear different things. I mean, from one perspective, we've never even come close in the upper basin to depleting the upper basin by 7.5 million acre feet. I think the most we've ever used collectively as the upper basin is like 5 million acre feet. Is that right?
Something like that. I think just south of 5 million acre feet. That's right, though. Yeah.
So from that
7.5.
From that standpoint, it doesn't seem like we have anything to worry about really for the foreseeable future. But there are other voices that we hear that consider that to be a delivery obligation. So I just wondered if you could kind of speak to that. And I mean, I don't think anybody knows where that's going to come down. But do you think that it's possible we're going to avoid years and years of litigation around that, and we'll actually be able to come to some copacetic, kind of an agreement where the lower basin will live within their means without calling for more water from us?
Well, geez, that's a big question. So I think, Phil, you raise a really good point that I'm speaking from a Colorado perspective. I'm talking about what we believe are our strong legal and policy positions on the Colorado River. We believe that you look at the plain language of the compact and the minutes that support them, and that all supports our view of the concept of a non-depletion obligation rather than a delivery obligation, and supports our view that when there are forces beyond our control that are causing the flow of the river to decline, and when we are using, by the way, 3 to 4 million acre feet less than our apportionment, we are certainly not causing the flow of the river to be depleted. So that is our legal argument. That is our position. Now, do other people in the basin disagree? They might, yes, they certainly might. But we feel good about that. We feel good about our position factually and legally, and think that we have done everything in our power to make sure that we are responsible stewards of the river. So, but those are our positions, and I think it's very fair and important to point out that doesn't mean everyone agrees to them. And even though, if you look at our 10-year aggregate now, it's something like, I want to say 88 million acre feet or so over a 10-year period. Don't quote me on that. I can't remember exactly, but we're well above any obligation that we would have. So, and on top of that, we feel good about the legal arguments that we would have, about our current uses and the non-depletion obligation. The fact is that scarcity drives conflict. So, I would love to sit here today and say that we will not end up in court, that we will not end up in litigation. I think we all feel that, collaborative approaches are definitely preferred. But again, I think when we're dealing with this level of scarcity, this level that the reservoirs have hit because of ongoing overuse in the lower basin coupled with low inflows, it's hard to say what will happen. But we are getting prepared for the future no matter what it is. So we would love to not litigate, but I think Attorney General Phil Weiser recently made a very public statement about the fact that we're ready for whatever might come our way. And we have a great team at the Attorney General's office backing us up.
Okay, thanks, Amy. I hope that wasn't too hard of a question. I didn't intend for it to be, but that is kind of the elephant in the room, I guess, in many respects. We've got just a couple more minutes. And so I guess the last thing I just wanted to ask you about, Amy, was on the role of the Bureau of Reclamation in managing our reservoirs in Colorado and Blue Mesa, and there are others. So I guess that's a concern, to irrigators on the western slope as well as the eastern slope, right? Is that the Bureau of Reclamation can theoretically kind of drain those reservoirs as they want to support lake levels in Powell, even though we desperately need that water here. So I just wondered, are we looking to maybe find, I guess, a happy medium here at the very least in protecting those waters for our own irrigators rather than sending them to the lower basin?
It may have just been on my end, but I think I got the gist of the question, but I didn't quite hear the last thing that you said, the actual question. Could you repeat that? Sorry.
So I guess the thing that concerns us is that we see the impacts of the release from Blue Mesa. There are other Bureau of Rec reservoirs in Colorado that they manage and can release water from. And that affects our irrigators and it affects our recreation industry. So I just wondered given the stark contrast you presented with the lower basin's use versus ours, do you think that is going to continue, or are we going to see some relief going forward in protecting our storage levels for our own irrigators, our own recreational industry, et cetera?
Got it. Okay. So one distinction I want to make at this point is the difference between Blue Mesa Reservoir, the Aspinall unit, versus some other projects in Colorado. The Aspinall unit is one of the initial units, along with Flaming Gorge and Navajo reservoirs. And those are the ones that are specifically identified in the Drought Response Operations Agreement that are meant to act in coordination with Lake Powell. So that's one of the reasons that Blue Mesa was targeted, so to speak, is that that is one of its purposes, is to help protect Lake Powell and things like that. But so we understand why Blue Mesa was the first up. That being said, we believe very strongly that reclamation going forward must consider the local impacts before calling for any additional reservoir releases. And you may have heard Becky Mitchell talk a lot about this and very passionately, and she's taken a very strong stance with the Bureau of Reclamation and said, what you didn't really work for us and for our communities. And so you need to be careful in the future. You need to really consider the impacts before doing that again. And the reality is Blue Mesa is so low now. They had toxic algae blooms as a result of these releases. And so I think everyone has heard that message and has seen it on the ground. And hopefully there will not be further releases from Blue Mesa Reservoir. The other projects in Colorado, federal projects, are not initial units, and that and so they don't necessarily operate in the same way that Blue Mesa would with relation to Lake Powell. They each have their own unique contracts, their own unique operating provisions, and so you kind of have to look at that to fully understand the scope of allowable uses and authorities. But what I can say is that Becky has taken a very strong position with respect to all of our projects in Colorado, that we do not think it's appropriate for those to be used to fix the crisis at Lake Powell and Lake Mead, which we did not create. So I think if that were to come about, that you could expect the state to have some opinions about that.
Okay. Well, lots to talk about. We're going to have to leave it there because we are up against 1 o'clock, a little past actually. So, but if you have additional questions, I am quite confident that Nora and Amy would be glad to field those, and you can email them or email me and I'll forward them on to Amy and Nora. And just want to mention again that this webinar is being recorded today, and so we'll post that later on the website, so you'll have access to it. And there will also be a highlights companion document that I'll put together that will kind of show just the high points if you don't have time to view the webinar. So a special thanks to our speakers, Nora Flynn and Amy Ostdiek. Really appreciate your time and all the information you shared. Really valuable information. So with that, I guess we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you again.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks, everyone.